He didn't just take my name, he took my daughter's trust and sold it back to us as a better future. The morning the doctored video went viral, my phone lit up, my job froze me out, and my own child, coached by a smooth stranger, asked, "Dad, can't you just sign and make this go away?" That single sentence split our house down the middle. I stood in the doorway of my late wife's secret boathouse with a brass key burning in my palm, realizing this wasn't a real estate deal. It was a slow theft of reputation, of legacy, of the place where our promises lived. From that crack, the tide began to turn, and I learned the only way to answer a smear isn't louder noise. It's a record that doesn't blink. Before today's story begins, we'd love to know, where are you watching from right now? Every time you share, it reminds us that these stories reach real people with real journeys. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time so you don't miss what's coming next. So pour yourself a drink, get comfortable, and let's step together into a story that just might stay with you long after it ends. Rain has a way of sanding a coast town down to the grain. It patters the gutters, it salts the paint, it pushes everything back toward its simplest form. Most mornings I wake to that soft percussion on our green clapboard house, make coffee in the dented percolator, and run a thumb along the nicks in my workbench until the past stops shouting. I used to command crews through burning buildings. Now I teach students how to true a board and listen for a planer's clean pitch. The discipline is the same. Know your tool, know your line, breathe through the heat. 8 years ago, a roof came down on my spine and took the firehouse from me. I took the classroom instead. It hasn't stopped the nights from arriving heavy and salt stiff. Elena loved data the way I love grain. Follow the lines, honor the pattern. She spent weeks at a time with graduate students up and down the Oregon coast, reading salinity and tide and the shy green pulse of eelgrass. A year ago, in a room that smelled like antiseptic and winter tangerines, she pressed my fingers and said, "Don't go to the boathouse." Promise me I promised because there was no second option in her eyes. I promised because sometimes love is the quietest form of obedience. After the funeral, I did the things men do when they are trying not to unspool. I scrubbed rust from hinges, taught dovetails until my throat went raw, and walked the seawall at dusk with my hands deep in the jacket she once stole when the wind came up. I thought if I kept my schedule simple enough, the mind would fold itself into it. But envelopes began to arrive with her name and the wrong return addresses. Research invoices months late. Wire transfers that made no sense for a state salary. A stiff manila packet addressed to the keeper of the boathouse. I stacked them under the sugar canister like a child hides a broken toy under a rug. Harper comes home less often now, which is the natural way of things, and somehow also the unkind way. She is 24 and speaks a language that sounds like English until you listen to the verbs. It's just finance, Dad. Deal flow. Term sheets. She smiles kindly when I furrow. You should let assets work, not sit. I don't tell her I once held a hose inside a tenement while the floor found a new definition for failure. That sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is sit still until the beam stops trembling. At the dinner table, we trade weather. Hers is numbers and optimism, mine is clouds and tide tables, and then she is out the door again to chase her bright future. We can optimize the future, she tells me, and I nod because I want that for her even if the word catches in my teeth like a splinter. There is a thin road that leaves town and skims the bay, and if you stand on the seawall at the right angle, you can see the boathouse slumping into reeds like an old dog. Low tin roof, narrow windows, a dock that stayed even when the county said it shouldn't. I keep my distance. Some nights I hear her voice in the wind as it snakes through the pilings. Not safe for you. It could be memory, it could be the gulls. Either way, I turn back before the shadows grow long enough to braid. Work is a good religion. I put freshmen through the catechism of measurement and patience. I speak to retirees about walnut's stubbornness and cedar's mercy. When the room is empty, I plane scrap until curls gather on the floor like autumn. There's a point when the blade sings, just before it bites, that feels like forgiveness. I learned to live between those notes. I learned to let the rain say what it needed and to keep my mouth shut against the questions that rattled. What did she fear there? Why lock a door against your own husband? A week of small tempests, another invoice with a university masthead I didn't recognize, 2 transfers marked field logistics, and a sticky note in Elena's square hand that read groundwater dredge permit tucked inside our dog-eared copy of The Old Man and the Sea. I had taped the hospital wristband to the inside of my shop drawer. I found myself tracing the letters of her name the way you trace coastlines on a map. Discipline says wait. Love says trust. Both feel like holding your breath. The mailman knows me by sound, the thunk of my boots, the hinge I still haven't oiled on the porch door. One late afternoon, with the rain eased to a hush, he pushed a padded envelope across the rail. Got something for you. I signed, the pen leaving a bruise of blue on the damp card, and watched him shrug back into the gray. Inside, wrapped in wax paper like a slice of pie, lay a small brass key, its teeth bright where use had polished them. There was a strip of paper torn from a field notebook, those faint green lines Elena favored when she wanted to think with a pen. In her hand, a single instruction: when ready. Chub. I sat there longer than I should have, listening to the distant thrum of surf and the closer tick of the kitchen clock. The key weighed almost nothing and somehow more than the house. I slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket and felt it settle against my ribs like a second heart. The old habits came up the way they do. Check the exits, count the heads, locate the hazard, name the wind. I told myself that readiness is a kind of tide. It goes out, it comes in, and a man doesn't wait until the sand firms underfoot. By nightfall, the rain returned, and the roof began its slow drum again. I turned off the shop light, ran my palm across the bench once more, and tried to believe that a promise can hold even while a door begins, secretly, to open. The key rode in my jacket all afternoon like a coin someone had pressed warm into my palm and dared me to spend. The sky sat low in pewter over the bay, rain ticked the gutters in a half-hearted rhythm, smearing the last of the daylight across the window like a thumbprint. I tried to grade a stack of joinery quizzes and couldn't hold a number in my head. Every time my hand drifted toward the pocket, I told myself it was only to check the lining, to feel for a rip, to make sure I wouldn't lose what I wasn't ready to use. The phone rang a little after 4. The voice was polite to the point of antiseptic, vowels ironed flat by training. He said he was calling on behalf of Pacific Crown Hospitality, that they were excited about a sustainable marina initiative and that they wanted to explore a constructive conversation with stakeholders who might have interests proximate to the project footprint. I asked him why he was calling me. He said, "We understand you may be the potential beneficiary of a small property near Nehalem Bay. We're committed to good neighbor outcomes." Then he thanked me for my time in a way that felt like a door closing from his side. When the line went dead, the kitchen seemed suddenly too small for the air inside it. Harper came in an hour later with her laptop tucked like a tray under her arm, cheeks bright from the rain. She had the rushed, useful energy I remember from the firehouse just before a shift. She talked about a class case study, about coastal development best practices, about how communities can unlock value when they optimize underutilized assets. I said I didn't know we had any assets to optimize. She grinned and said a friend of hers, a startup advisor named Devin, had looked at some maps and thought our zip code was going to be hot. "We should get in front of it," she said, and kissed my cheek, already opening her calendar. I nodded and stirred the soup and kept my eyes on the spoon, because sometimes a man has to pretend to study the thing in his hand to keep from studying the thing in his heart. We ate quickly. She took a call in the bedroom, speaking the bright new language that makes the future sound like a whiteboard. I stood at the sink until the water ran cold, then dried my hands and looked out at the night, fingering its way over the bay. The key answered me through the pocket like a thud. Readiness, Elena had taught me, is not a mood. It's a measurement. Out on the seawall, the wind pulled at the trees and the rain stepped down into something steadier. I wrote a note for Harper, went to the shop, and left it on the table where she would find it and not worry. The road to Nihilim runs like a seam between water and woods. At night, it is a thread you must not pull too hard. Reeds leaned over the shoulder and combed the truck in whispery strokes. When I killed the headlights at the turnout, the world didn't go dark so much as polite. Even the gulls quieted to let the rain speak. I stepped out carefully. My back gave its usual cold protest, a row of nails set just deep enough to remind me of my limits. The dock planks were slick and black as a river rock. Far out, the channel showed its ribs, tied down, and the little boats turned their noses the same way, like dogs scenting a change. The boathouse wore its neglect the way old men wear good hats. Tin roof low to the water, narrow windows, paint that had given up the argument years ago. I stood with my hand on the knob and let the firehouse habits run. Scan, listen, smell. No generator hum. No fresh footprints on the wet boards, only the blurred history of her shoes and mine from other lives. I slid the key in. The cylinder turned with the smooth, oily ascent of a mechanism that has been kept ready for one person only. Inside smelled like salt and old paper and a memory of diesel. I closed the door and clicked on my flashlight, pinning the room with a blade of yellow. This was not a hideaway. This was a lab that had taught itself to live in a shack. A table along the east wall carried a spread of laminated charts, tide predictions, and a chipped mug full of grease pencils. A battered conductivity meter sat beside a stack of field notebooks tied with twine. On a shelf, mason jars labeled by date held water the color of tea. Against the far wall, a steel safe squatted under a belt of ratchet straps, as if the building itself had sworn to keep it down. A calico of stains mapped the plywood underfoot, where wet gear had hung to weep. I checked the windows, the simple latches, the seam where door met jamb. The rain worried at the roof in short little fists. Somewhere under the floor, a plank complained and settled. The room was full of Elena's hand without holding a single photograph of her. She had always been the neatest kind of messy, a precision that made room for improvisation. I knew the angle she would bend over a notebook. I could feel the small impatience in her wrist when a pen wouldn't start. In that familiarity was a kind of trespass I had not expected to feel. I had promised to stay away. I was here anyway. On the main table, next to a map of dredged lanes traced in red pencil, lay a small digital recorder and a square of paper torn from a field book. The message was written in her quick, right-leaning script. Gabe, only press play if you truly want to know. I rested my hands on the table so I would not press the button by accident. Then I pressed it on purpose. The little speaker crackled and filled the room with rain recorded on some other night. Elena's voice came in after it, steady but thinner than I was used to. If you're listening, it means I couldn't finish what I started. The boathouse isn't a secret I kept from you. It's buffer. It's evidence. Things are moving out there at night that aren't supposed to move. They cut the water when the bay is asleep. She paused, and I heard the tiny scrape of pen on paper, her old thinking tick. Don't act on anger. Watch the tide. It tells you when to go. I clicked the recorder off, and the present rushed back into the room like a draft. I lowered myself to the floorboards because the chair looked like a lie. The damp came up through my jeans and set my knees ringing. I let the flashlight's beam wander. It moved across an index card labeled Salinity Anomalies, lingered on a nylon bag of sensor cables, passed over the steel safe with its tired patience. The rain clattered and then softened. Out beyond the wall, a rope creaked in its cleat like a voice clearing. What I had opened wasn't only a door, it was a seam that ran under the town and under my life, and out into the channel where the lights go and come. Behind me, the lock sat easy in its strike plate, content to be a lock again. I stood, shut the recorder inside a drawer, and took one more slow walk of the room, the way you do after the fire is out, when you look for the spark that might still be hiding. When I stepped back into the rain, the bay had shaved another inch off the pilings, and the path was slick with the shine of decision. I pulled the door until it latched. The key was warm from my hand. I put it back in my pocket and let it beat there, quiet as a second heart all the way home. By morning, the rain had thinned to a mist that made the shop lights look like halos. I unlocked the wood lab, flipped on the dust collector, and breathed the clean mechanical hush that comes before a class. The floor smelled of linseed and last night's cedar. I was laying out chisels when a man in a slate suit appeared in the open bay. Rain purled on his shoulders as if the weather respected his fabric. He introduced himself by first and last name I forgot immediately, and a title I didn't need. The badge clipped to his pocket read Pacific Crown Hospitality. He didn't stroll so much as arrange his weight where he wanted it, putting the glossy portfolio on my bench as if we shared ownership of the grain. Color maps spilled out, renderings of a marina bright as a toy, solar awnings, heron silhouettes, happy kayakers in improbable weather. He pointed with a capped pen. Ecological restoration, small business incubators, public benefits, he said. We're eager to reduce conflict through fair, forward-looking agreements. I asked why he was telling me this here, between clamps and glue. His smile made room for the first ghost of boredom. Our understanding is that you may be connected to a modest parcel near the project footprint, he said. We'd like to open a channel. He slid a card across the bench. The email domain wasn't the main company's. It wore an extra syllable like a disguise. I said I would review anything he left and speak to counsel before responding. He nodded as if we had rehearsed it together, collected nothing, and left the scent of expensive rain behind him. When the door shut, the shop felt too carefully arranged. I turned the card over in my hand and saw nothing useful but a name to remember. The students trickled in, and I washed the encounter out of my voice with the familiar liturgy. Measure twice, feel for the snipe, keep the edge honest. After class, I drove to the Boathouse because the only cure for a stranger's certainty is my own eyes on my own ground. Inside, the recorder still waited where I'd left it. I pressed play and held the bench with both hands. Elena's voice filled the shack, thinner than before, as if recorded later on a shorter breath. Watch the channel after midnight, she said. They dredge when the bay is asleep. Log the coordinates and the water's taste. Keep the notebooks together. The pattern only makes sense when it's stacked. There was a short rasp, the sound of her pen starting and not quite catching. I moved title into a truss so the boathouse can't be pulled into somebody else's orbit if I'm not here. May's the first trustee. She'll know when to hand you the second key. I drove inland to the little street where May Coleman lived, a block of modest houses tucked behind a nursery full of succulents. She answered the door with a walker and a fox-bright look. The living room held neat piles, field guides, mugs, an old sextant mounted like a relic. I said Elena had asked me to come if I needed the key. May studied my face as if comparing it to something Elena had drawn. Then she went to a desk, opened a drawer, and withdrew a sealed envelope the color of Tide mud. The wax was sea green and pressed with a notch that looked like a wave. She told me to wait until you used the first one, May said. Said you'd know what that meant. I nodded, because I did. Back in the truck, I held the envelope for a full minute before breaking the seal. Inside lay three things: a scrap with a string of numbers and letters that read like a password, a hand-drawn map of the boathouse floor with a small X beneath the table, and a card headed with Elena's tidy script: storm cellar, contents, drive, redundancies, bay testimony, 12 points. Use the tide. The hatch was where she'd said, I slid the table, pried up a section of plank she had disguised with a strip of weathered molding, and found a recessed ring flush to the plywood. Cold air rose when I lifted it, smelling of concrete and storage. A ladder went down into a box of a room barely taller than I am. Shelves lined the walls with desiccants tucked like little lungs among the hard cases. I unlatched the largest one, found an encrypted external drive padded in foam, a row of USB sticks labeled by date, and a printed packet bound with string. The Bay testimony, 12 points. I skimmed the headings, permitting eelgrass regression, nocturnal turbidity spikes, corporate structure notes, and could feel Elena's mind in the order of it, the way a good joint reveals the hand that cut it. This wasn't obsession, it was architecture. I called Harper because truth should have a witness when you can stand it. I asked her to come by, said I wanted to show her how her mother thought. She arrived quicker than I expected, with Devin beside her, tall and nice-looking, in a way that photographs well. His handshake was dry and firm. He looked around the boathouse with the quick inventorying glance of a buyer. Before I could open a case, he rolled out a sentence like a smooth pier. There's an opportunity here to tell a responsible transition story. Public-private partnership, community benefit agreements, the whole toolkit. Harper's eyes shone the way they do when she's solving. We could actually steer the thing, Dad, she said. I told them I wanted to understand the data before we talked about anybody's story. Devin's smile didn't move. We shouldn't overcomplicate a simple win, he said. Let professionals handle the heavy lifting. I felt the old heat in my neck and let it pass. We'll start with facts, I said. Harper bit her lip, impatient. The market isn't going to wait for your tide tables. They left when the rain thickened, promising to set up a meeting with the right people. Twilight papered the windows in gray. I kept working until the labels stopped swimming, sorted drives, photographed pages, logged what I'd touched. The bay made the small, hollow sounds of water learning wood. A gust slashed the roof, and then I heard a sound that wasn't weather. Metal kissing metal where the latch meets the hasp. I killed the light, the world compressed to shudders of rain and one sharp beam crawling a seam in the window. Footsteps, careful, sliding, testing weight. Another lick of light, this time probing the plank gap where weather sneaks in. I stood by the hatch, the dark pressing both my shoulders, and counted my breath like we did on stairs whose heat we couldn't see. Whoever it was worked the lock for a full, courteous minute, then stopped as if listening to the inside of the house. The beam flicked away, boots moved off the dock in the unhurried patience of someone who knows they'll be back. When I turned the light on, the room looked indistinguishable from the one I'd lit off an hour earlier. That's the trick of intrusion. It lets the air remember even when the furniture doesn't. I set the deadbolt, ran a second hasp through the latch, and checked the windows again. Out beyond the reeds, a small light stitched itself into the rain and then unstitched. Elena had told me to watch the tide. Standing there with the key warm in my pocket and the damp in my knees, I understood the corollary. Pick your moment, or the moment picks you. Astoria wore its usual gray like a uniform, the river hunched under it, the cannery roofs beating rain. Lydia Shu's office sat over a shop that sold charts and tide books. Inside, the radiators hissed, and the air smelled of coffee that had boiled a minute too long. Shelves bowed with case reporters and field guides. A coastal map unrolled across her table, tacked at the corners with fountain pens. She read the trust documents the way a Finnish carpenter reads grain, head down, pencil quick. Her notes arrived as clean hatch marks in the margins. She didn't waste sympathy. She drew a box around the title transfer and tapped it with the pencil's dull end. Solid, she said. Another tap at a paragraph on trustee powers. Also solid. Then she turned the page and looked up. If they're rational, they won't start with court. They'll start with you, your reputation. Expect noise before law. I nodded because that lined up with the man in the slate suit and the beam on the boathouse window. Lydia spread a yellow pad into 3 columns and wrote headers with the fast neatness of someone who thinks in sequences: legal, data, community. Under legal, she listed notice to preserve evidence, open records requests, and a calendar of hearings that led toward a permit review. Under data, she wrote inventory, chain of custody, replication, and no data dumps. Under community, she wrote fishermen, tribal liaisons, school science teachers, and 2 reporters whose names I recognized. She pushed the pad to me. Story has to walk in this order: facts, process, people. Anything else feeds their machine. We drove back to the boathouse in a rain that had thickened from gauze to cord. Lydia stood just inside the door, eyes adjusting, then began to count out loud to keep tempo. Charts, logs, jars, devices. We labeled the USB sticks by date and waypoint, set the encrypted drive into a Pelican case, and photographed the notebook pages before sliding them into sleeves. When she ran a fingertip across a series of night photos, the light from the window picked out the pale streak of a dredge lamp and the choppy constellation of disturbed water. The salinity charts showed teeth where the bay should have hummed. A pattern emerged the way a picture does from the far end of a jigsaw. The work happened when the tide was at its longest lean. I opened a new notebook and wrote Bay Log GW on the first line. The old muscles remembered: time, weather, tide stage, smell, light, sound, any anomaly, and a line for my back so I would stop pretending it didn't speak. On another page, I copied Elena's instruction: use the tide, and boxed it in red. The act of writing slowed the panic until it chose a chair and sat down. Harper texted that she was coming by. I vacuumed the sawdust from my cuffs and set the papers in an order that made sense to a mind that wasn't mine. She arrived with a blue binder and rain on her sleeves, breath quick from the walk. She didn't look at the jars or the maps first. She opened the binder to the tab Elena had labeled, slid the page under the desk lamp, and pointed to a paragraph I had skimmed without understanding its weight. The language was patient and absolute. Beneficiary designation: Harper Whitaker. The room went a notch quieter. She read the sentence aloud, not to triumph, but to make it real. It says, "I'm the primary beneficiary." Her voice wasn't hard. It was convinced. I found a chair for my knees and set my hands on it. "It says you inherit responsibility," I answered. "It puts the key in your pocket, not a price tag on the door." She shook her head, eyes bright with purpose. "We can protect what matters and still be smart." Devin says partnership lets us steer outcomes. This is a chance to optimize for the family and the bay. I kept my mouth from finding the old lecture tone. I told her we would start with the truth that fits in evidence bags. She closed the binder carefully and hugged it to her ribs like a class case. "Opportunities don't wait," she said, and the words left a draft when she turned for the steps. An email from Devin arrived before the door finished settling. The subject line wore charm like cologne. In the body, he pitched efficiency. There was no need to overcomplicate a community win. Experts could shape the narrative to diffuse unhelpful opposition. We could get to yes fast. I reread the line about shaping and felt something in my shoulders square. I forwarded the email to Lydia. Her reply came back with one word and a period. Noted. She sent the preservation letters that afternoon to the port to a contractor with a name that did not match the badge I'd been shown, to a shell company with a domain that resembled the main corporate site the way a counterfeit bill resembles a paycheck. She calendared 2 weeks of work like a training plan: night surveillance aligned with low tide, sensor maintenance, a batch of records requests to pry loose dredge permits and subcontractor rosters. She pushed a printed schedule across the table with the same plainness she'd used for the pad. "You're not a hero here," she said. "You're a witness." I took that home the way you carry a tool your hand doesn't love yet. Witness means standing your ground without declaring a war you can't win in a day. It means writing things down when the part of you that once ran toward sirens wants to run toward something else. That night I cooked eggs that tasted like the pan and stared at the chair across the table until it was too heavy to look at. Then I went back to the bay because the work doesn't do itself. Rain worked the roof hard. The boathouse smelled like wet nails and old rope. I checked the deadbolt, clicked the secondary hasp through, tested the window latches, and nudged the hatch cover with my boot so it sang that low wood note that says seated. I set my watch to the tide chart and let the minute hand teach me patience. Out in the channel, a horn spoke once and was quiet. A glow far off wavered and wove itself away. The phone face lit my cheek. Harper again, a picture of a meeting invite with Devin's name and 3 others I didn't know, and a caption that tried to be gentle. Let's be efficient. I typed, erased, and finally sent 4 words that were heavier than they looked. We'll start with evidence. The 3 dots pulsed and died. The room felt like a held breath. I worked another hour, long enough for my back to set its limits and the rain to tire of itself. When I locked up, the key turned with that same patient assent. I stood on the dock and let the wind lift the sweat from my shirt. The bay had dropped again, bare pilings in the moon's thin wash, eelgrass like hair combed low. I thought of Elena's voice through the little speaker. Watch the tide. The lesson is older than law and younger than grief. You don't step just because you want to. You step when the sand goes firm under your heel. I put the notebook in my pocket, pulled the hood up, and walked the boards back toward the truck, counting the planks like rosary beads against the noise I knew was coming. Are you following every twist? Type number 1 below to tell me you're in. Let's move forward. The video found me before daylight. A student sent a link, and there I was, jaw squared, voice spliced, captions framing me as angry obstruction. Someone had clipped a moment from class when I barked at a planer and bent it around words I never said. The thumbnail caught me half-word, the way headlines like they're villains. By 8, the dean left a courteous voicemail about cooling off optics. At 9, an email placed me on temporary leave while the college assessed concerns raised by the community. At the market, a neighbor discovered she needed 5 minutes with a pair. 2 other phones rose like periscopes. A letter from Pacific Crown waited on the kitchen table, all careful compliments and regrets. They offered a path to reduce tension for all stakeholders, quick purchase above appraisal, standard non-disparagement, so conversations stay positive. I let the coffee cool beside it, then slid the letter under Elena's recorder like you pin a beetle. Harper called with the looseness of someone carrying a load. She said the clip was a hatchet job, the suspension unfair, and then, searching for dry ground, said, "Just sign, Dad." I told her we would put facts in order first. She sighed, said she couldn't keep fighting everyone, and hurried to class. At the boathouse, I opened a folder Elena had titled The Long Ebb. She wrote about the odd quiet when the bay leans farthest from shore. Boats hanging on their ropes, gulls waiting it out. Don't act when the water tells you to wait, sat alone on a line. Everything loud is shallow. I read it twice and felt heat slide out of my neck like a nail backing from wood. Low tide arrived just after midnight. I worked the way a borrowed minute asks you to. I mounted a small camera at the edge where dock shadow gives way to open water, checked cards and batteries, opened my notebook, dated the page, and wrote the air's taste, iron, rain-cooled, because truths survive cross-examination. Across the channel, a single yellow showed, set, came again. The dredge's lamp unzipped the rain. Under it, the water thickened from glass to milk. My timer chirped. I took a run of stills, then a minute of video, then another. I read coordinates off the handheld and wrote them twice, once in the book, once on a card I slipped into my pocket. The bay has a voice when something large moves wrong. It speaks in the bones behind the ears. I log that too, even if bones aren't admissible. Before sleeping, I uploaded files to Lydia and texted a summary. Time, place, weather, 3 clips, 4 stills, salinity spike on the stubborn sensor. Her reply came 15 minutes later with a list of recipients. Preservation notices would go out before dawn. The subject line was the opposite of the headline that chased me. It said simply, "Logged." The smear grew legs. An accountability page collaged my face beside phrases I hadn't uttered. Another site lifted a photo from Harper's feed, cropped out her laugh, and captioned me, "Obstructionist Father." Lydia tugged thread. By afternoon, she had a diagram. The page that hosted the first clip wasn't owned by Pacific Crown, but by a green-sounding fund that sells story alignment, bankrolled through a shell that shares an office suite with a vendor on the port's B. Then she sent the attachment that bent me. It was a media participation agreement. At the bottom sat Harper's signature in blue. The document allowed use of family imagery and narrative arcs to illustrate a community's journey toward a sustainable future, with editorial approval delegated to the project team. Written to sound harmless, engineered to make examples out of people who never consented to being lessons. I walked outside because weather can rinse the noise a little. I watched the ripples choose a direction. I thought of Harper's first bicycle, how she demanded I keep a hand on the seat until my letting go felt exactly like holding on. Anger rose, bright and useless. I called Lydia instead. "We don't burn her," I said. "We build the record." "Good," she said, and let silence take the rest. So I built it. I backed up every clip to 3 drives and sealed 2 in bags with the date scrawled across tape. I printed contact sheets, wrote times and angles in the margins, and stored originals in May's old firebox. I sent the files to myself and mailed a thumb drive to the post office box I keep for emergencies that should stop at 2. I wrote the night's log in a hand a stranger could trust. By 3, the dredge light had sewn itself back into darkness. My back tolled its small, steady bell. The boathouse had the patient sway of a body that has decided not to sleep. I stepped out, tested the dock with my heel, and felt the surface firm under rubber. Sand takes a moment to remember strength after water goes. You wait with it. You wait until the next move is not a fight but a step. Then you take it now. Morning came colorless and steady, the kind of light that makes a man sort screws by thread just to feel order return. The boathouse held the smell of damp rope and coffee I'd forgotten on the windowsill. I called Lydia before I let my thoughts bloom beyond nouns. She answered on the first ring, voice already at work. We walked the plan like a tide chart, schedule a public hearing at the port and at the state board, file the civil complaint to protect the property and the bay, prepare a referral requesting a criminal conflict of interest review. Evidence, process, people, she said. No hot takes. I wrote the 3 words on a card and taped it to the inside of my notebook. I asked Harper to meet me on the Seawall Cafe because rooms carry memory the way shirts carry smoke, and I needed a neutral place. The windows sweated from wet coats and steamed milk. The barista's machine hissed like a snake with good manners. I took the booth by the fogged pane and set a tablet on the formica. When Harper arrived, she had the posture of someone braced for a closing argument. I didn't argue. I slid the tablet across and pressed play. Elena's face filled the glass, alive in the way our dead remain when we refuse to let the world edit them. She was sitting in an empty room I recognized only by the light. Her voice was small from the recording, but the cadence was Elena's, calm, exact. "Harper, if you're watching, I chose to keep you out of a sickness you didn't ask to carry," she said. "I put your name on the trust because the boathouse must belong to someone who understands promise. This isn't a vault, it's a vow." She talked about eelgrass and how truth sets down roots in quiet water. She apologized for the year we lost to silence. She asked our daughter to be braver than her mother when the time came. We let the video end without touching anything. Silver lines from the window ran across Harper's cheekbones. I opened a thin folder and showed her the clause she'd signed in a bright room where the pens matched the bottled water. I explained how family imagery becomes a lever, how story alignment is a blade sanded until it feels like a handshake. She read, then rested her head in her hands in a posture so young my throat hurt. Shame flushed, then receded, anger followed, sharper, more useful. She looked up and studied the water beating down the glass. "We fix this by telling the truth," she said. I nodded because there was nothing else that would hold. We talked through cost. She would have to call Devin and pull consent, not privately, but in writing and on a thread that included everyone who had been given the false right to manage our faces. She would have to stand beside me at the hearing and say her name and role aloud. She might lose friends who confuse momentum with wisdom. I would have to stand very still while the internet tried to teach me who I was. We agreed to it like people agreeing to stand in cold surf. Together, quickly, without letting the mind talk the body out of courage. Lydia joined us by phone on speaker, her voice a metronome. She rattled deadlines, names of clerks, statutes that open doors if you knock with the correct accreditation number. She assigned us roles as if we were a two-person crew working opposite ends of a hall. I would complete the chain of custody notes and expand the logbook to include the camera's calibration steps. Harper would write a beneficiary statement, why the trust exists, what stewardship means when a company calls something a community that is not, and rehearse it until the words felt natural in her mouth. Lydia would file records requests for dredge permits and subcontractor rosters, flag the domains that matched the Green Fund's shell, and draft the civil complaint so it could be stamped the morning after the hearing. We left the cafe with the weather leaning against us, like an old friend who doesn't apologize for his wait. On the sidewalk, Harper typed with her thumb, frowning slightly the way she did as a child when tying her shoes. She showed me the message, a clear revocation of media use, a request to delete materials, a statement that any continued use would be unauthorized. She hit send before she could rewrite it into comfort. Devin replied in under a minute, the text frictionless enough to be mass-produced. "Don't shoot yourself in the foot," it said. Harper typed only, "This is final," then put the phone in her pocket and breathed like a runner resetting the race. Back at the Boathouse, I copied last night's files to labeled drives and printed a checklist for checking my own checklists. It felt fussy and necessary. I drew a simple map of the camera placement and stapled it to the log. I packed spare cards and gaffer tape. I numbered batteries with a Sharpie. The act of preparation is the small mercy work gives men who can't bend the sky. In the late afternoon, we stood on the seawall because bodies sometimes make better promises without furniture. The bay wore an iron color and a soft chop. We walked to the marker where Elena once pointed out the difference between foam and spindrift, where she taught me that patience is not waiting, it's working at the correct speed. Harper talked about the questions she feared and the ones she hoped someone would ask. I told her about the only 2 times I'd been afraid on a fire, and how breath, counted honestly, had let me choose rather than react. We didn't hold hands, but our steps found the same rhythm. Evening put a bruise across the water. I made a new entry, date, pressure, cloud type, tide turning on the hour, daughter committed, father steadied, counsel ready. Above it, inside the red pencil box, the words I kept stitching into my thoughts. Use the tide. The long water asks you to earn it. We had chosen it, and it was choosing us back. The hearing room was a long cedar box with plastic chairs shoved in rows until the aisles forgot they were aisles. It smelled like damp coats and budget coffee. Rain chased itself across the high windows and made a metronome of the gutters. Fishermen in caps lined one wall, a tribal representative in a ribbon shirt sat near the front. and 3 cameras stared from tripods like patient dogs. A row of suits occupied the second bench. Pacific Crown's people, polished and hard to photograph wrong. When they called my name, the floor seemed to tilt a degree. It was only my back reminding me to stand like I knew how. I put the packet on the lectern and spoke to the board, not the cameras. Lydia's order ran under my words like a rhythm line. Facts, process, people. I summarized 5 of the 12 points. Turbidity spikes that bloomed after midnight. Coordinates logged within minutes of those blooms. Night photos showing a dredge lamp combing the channel. The periodicity locked toward the lowest water. Permit language that went slack where it should have been tight. I named the devices, the timestamps, the file paths, the chain of custody from dock to drive. I asked for a hold on nighttime operations, not a verdict on character. Paper makes a small sound when you turn it in a microphone. I let the sound prove I had brought more than anger. I read the closing line I'd written in block letters so the adrenaline wouldn't edit it. We're asking for time to examine what the tide is already telling us. Then I stepped back and held still while the chair thanked me in a voice that was all polished wood. Harper rose when they called her. She wore her student blazer and my wife's steady eyes. She stated her name for the record and the role Elena had signed into her life. I am the beneficiary of the Whitaker Boathouse Trust, she said, and that means stewardship. She explained that she had signed a media consent believing it harmless, that she was withdrawing it in full, that any continued use would be unauthorized. Her words were plain and unornamented, and the room's sound changed by a shade I felt in my ribs more than heard. Pacific Crown's representative approached the mic and deployed the tone that makes unpleasant things sound like policy. He affirmed the company's commitment to community values, asked innocent questions about sampling methods, and promised an internal review. Lydia rose from a side seat and asked that his promise be entered into the minutes with dates and that the port produce a schedule of all nighttime equipment movements for the last 90 days. His smile held. His eyes did math. After the hallway performed its little churn, reporters angling for quotes, neighbors deciding whether to nod, I kept my mouth closed until Lydia tapped my elbow toward a quiet stairwell. Good, she said. Next. The next was the college's disciplinary meeting, a room with acoustic tiles and a table that had heard too many apologies. I presented a side-by-side of the posted clip and the raw classroom file, then the station's short piece from the 6 o'clock news explaining how the smear had been built. The dean didn't rescind the leave. Institutions are careful machines, but his thank you had a different weight when he spoke the word review. Back at the boathouse, rain found its old key and played the roof. I opened a smaller box Elena had labeled ancillary, a word she used when she meant look harder. Inside, a sequence of receipts and emails traced a stream of research support through a company with the same root as a Pacific Crown contractor, paid into a foundation tied to a port commissioner the month Elena's grant was audited and the month a permit sailed through committee. It was a map drawn in money. I called Lydia and told her what the paper said. She told me to write only what I could swear to, then drafted a formal request for investigation into conflicts of interest and permitting procedure. I did not write the sentence the anger offered me about Elena's death. It belonged to a different room and a different tide. The phones kept finding us. A fisherman I knew only by boat color described nets that came up cloudy on moonless nights. The tribal representative asked that the record note cultural use of the flats and the history written there long before our maps. A reporter at the back asked why I hadn't gone public sooner. Because data has to be safe before it can become a voice, I said, and felt the answer fit the question without flattering me. By dusk, the bay had pulled its gray blanket up to its chin. I checked locks as if the act could quiet the mind. The drives lay labeled in their case like tools arranged for morning. My phone chimed with Harper's name. She had posted a statement withdrawing consent and explaining why. Friends were already correcting her future in the comments. "I'm okay," she wrote. "I'd rather be clear than liked." I typed back the only honest thing, "Proud of you." Then I put the phone face down and wrote the day's entry in the log. Hearing held, request filed, press mixed, community warmer than yesterday, rain constant. Before leaving, I stood at the door and let the room settle. Residual fear circled once and perched somewhere I could keep it in view. The dock flexed, then firmed. In the distance, a horn spoke once like a man clearing his throat before choosing words. I turned out the light and locked the boathouse twice, then started for the truck through grass that had decided to be greener come morning. The tide had begun to turn, which is not a guarantee but a direction, and sometimes direction is enough to carry a man into the next hour without breaking him. The morning after the hearing, the bay looked scraped clean. The clouds pulled into long gray ribs. I was logging notes when my phone buzzed with a number I recognized from a business card I'd pretended to misplace. The man from Pacific Crown sounded like he'd practiced on voicemail. He proposed a tactical reset. Suspend night operations, assemble a 30-day working group, keep tempers from hardening. I told him any talk would happen in the open with a record. "Of course," he said, and the word landed like a coaster under a sweating glass. Lydia reserved the town's community room and arranged the chairs in a circle that refused corners. She set a cheap webcam on a tripod and tested the stream to a private link. Ground rules went up on the whiteboard in her square script. Facts, arrow, process, arrow, people. When the room filled, we were an odd raft. 2 corporate reps in ironed blues, a port staffer, 3 fishermen with hands like rope, the tribal liaison in a cedar hat, a science teacher with a clipboard, Harper and me with our notebooks. The building smelled like paper and old basketball. The legal rep led with policy bromides. The engineer talked in cross-sections and tolerances. Lydia let them run, then clicked her pen once. "Conditions first," she said. "Then we can alphabetize." I laid out our non-negotiables in order the way Elena would have. An open dashboard for all sensors, regardless of who paid for them. No night dredging during the review window. A revised alignment to skirt the eelgrass flats. The boathouse formally designated as a community science station, named for my wife and governed by a local fund. A rapid response complaint protocol with teeth. I slid a paper map across the table with a red-penciled curve drawn like a different future. There was the usual intake of air before the play begins. The engineer studied the curve, tracing it with a capped pen as if testing a seam. "We can shift 50 yards without losing structural logic," he said. The legal man agreed to suspend nights pending evaluation and nodded at parallel sensors so long as methods were documented. Lydia turned the nods into sentences. A 60-day memorandum with a schedule, standard operating procedures for monitoring, a commitment to publish weekly summaries, a clause that barred the use of family imagery in any communications. Unrestricted support, the legal rep offered, to the community station. Lydia rephrased it into a grant with no branding or editorial strings. The teacher asked for space to host students. The liaison asked for an early tide walk to mark sacred shell middens. I wrote both into a margin and underlined them twice. We broke for 10 minutes that turned into 15 because people talk better around coffee that tastes like a fundraiser. I stepped into the hallway and called the college. The dean's tone had shed its defensive lacquer. The news segment had landed. An external review of the doctored clip was underway. My status flipped from suspension to paid leave for process review. He asked if I would consider a workshop on evidence stewardship when the dust settled. "If the tide allows," I said, and let us both hear the joke. By afternoon, the room had become less of a fight and more of a design charrette with consequences. The fishermen offered boat time to lay the community cables along the channel edge. The tribal liaison volunteered a cultural monitor to accompany any shore work. We set the first field day for Saturday. The science teacher reserved the school van and promised boots that fit. The Pacific Crown engineer, to his credit, wrote his cell number on the board for night alerts and didn't wince when the chalk squeaked. Lydia printed the moo on the room's wheezing machine, clipped it with a red binder clip she brings to all good endings, and read each clause aloud. Data will be made publicly available via dashboard and API. No night operations absent emergency with written notice. Revised alignment as per Map B. Elena Tidewatch Station recognized as community governed. No corporate branding, funding unrestricted. Rapid complaint pathway, violation triggers, and automatic hold request. The signatures went down with the reluctant neatness of people doing what they didn't plan to do that morning. The webcam caught the pen lifts and the brief, unphotogenic slumps after. We walked back to the boathouse with a borrowed cart and cleared the central bench for a control panel that didn't yet exist. May arrived in a rain hat and gave orders with the authority of someone who still knows where Elena kept spare fuses. Harper measured the wall, penciled a level line, and mounted a tablet screen for the dashboard we hadn't built. I planed a cedar offcut and burned the words with a soldering iron. Elena Tidewatch. Community science. The teacher stood in the doorway and pointed out where a dozen field trip kids could stand without breaking anything. The fisherman carried in a spool of cable like a sleeping animal and left it in a coil that smelled faintly of sun. The liaison taught us how to pronounce the old name for the flat and told a short story about clam gardens that worked the tide instead of against it. By evening, the local station aired a longer piece that walked viewers through the smear's anatomy. The loudest green accounts went suddenly devotional about other topics. The message from Devon arrived as a two-line frost. Best of luck. Steer clear of sunk costs. It took less effort than anger to let it slide. Harper posted a short note about why she chose duty over speed and turned off comments. Then she sat beside me with a manual open and learned the difference between a conductivity hiccup and a failing connector. Lefty-loosey, she said, and grinned when the stubborn caller gave. The college email arrived late. The leave reclassified, the workshop request formalized. I printed it and tucked it under the MOU like a backing board. We met the engineer at the dock with headlamps and walked the new alignment under a moon that couldn't decide. He pointed, we counterpointed, the liaison marked a line in wet sand with a willow switch. We all stepped back and saw the curve like a thing that wanted to fit. After the others left, we hung the cedar sign and wired the first two sensors to the makeshift board. The dashboard skeleton blinked to life. A pulse in the corner of the screen that felt like a chest finding its rhythm after a hard run. I wrote the day's entry. Working group formed, nights paused, MOU signed, dashboard in progress, school trip scheduled, line shifted, Devon receded, storm online, quieting. Harper labeled a fresh notebook station log, HW, and slid it into the shelf next to bay log, GW. The two spines leaned together like oars. From the dock, the bay wore evening in layers. Steel, then pewter, then a soft bruise. The lines at the cleats creaked less. A gull walked the rail as if inspecting what we'd made. I knew we hadn't won anything permanent. The real negotiation sat ahead, hard drawings, permit edits, budgets with numbers that don't blink. But the water was rising in the right direction, and the boards under my boots felt firmer than they had in months. That's not victory. It's footing. Sometimes footing is the difference between a story that folds and one that goes on breathing into the next tide. The port chamber looked brighter than I remembered, the wood polished and the rain outside merciful instead of argumentative. A printed packet lay at each seat with the kind of numbering that says somebody finally did the arithmetic. Resolution 2341 sat on the dais, a neat stack under a brass gavel. When they read it aloud, the words landed like boards on joists. No nighttime dredging, absent emergency with written notice and independent oversight. Realignment per map B to avoid the eelgrass flats. A public data dashboard with API access and a formal chain of custody. A 72-hour pause automatically triggered by a verified complaint. The vote was less dramatic than my heart expected. Hands rose, the chair said carried, the room exhaled. It wasn't triumph, it was a foundation. On the walk out, my back loosened half a notch. Lydia folded her copy once, then again, the way a person folds a map to the part they need. Nail it to the wall, she said. I pictured a clipboard by the boathouse door with resolution 2341 under a thumbtack and felt something like gravity reset. By noon, the local inspector's office posted a bulletin the color of a traffic cone. Their preliminary review confirmed violations of gift rules tied to a foundation with a name too generous to be true. The file would move to the state. The commissioner named in our paperwork would recuse from votes touching the channel. I read the memo twice and wrote a single line in the log. Conflict review opened. No claims beyond process. In the afternoon, we met in a smaller room with worse coffee to turn the 60-day memorandum into a 3-year framework. The Pacific Crown engineer brought red-line drawings with the new curve formalized. The legal rep arrived with a team that tried to look casual. Lydia walked us through each clause like she was laying out a cut list. Seasonal work windows would avoid spawning and migration. A quarterly eelgrass restoration fund would be administered by a local nonprofit. And Elena Scholarship would seed 3 students a year toward environmental science if they stayed to intern on the bay. Family imagery was barred from all communications, irrespective of context. Data would be published in simple formats with a maintenance budget for the dashboard so it wouldn't die of neglect. We negotiated verbs into nouns and back until the sentences held. The PR people wrote nothing and blinked as if the lights were slightly too bright. The college email arrived while we were initialing page numbers. The subject line didn't perform. It said, status update. The body recognized the clip as doctored, lifted the suspension, and asked me to return the following term with a request to run a workshop on evidence stewardship for the campus and the community. I read it once and let it sit without ceremony. Later, I would smell the shop again, that solvent sweet calm, and remember how a room can return a man to himself without asking him to forget. 2 Saturdays later, the boathouse put on its public face for the first time without feeling like a costume. We hung the cedar sign, Elena Tidewatch, Community Science, so it could be seen from the dock. The dashboard pulsed alive on a mounted tablet beside a laminated key, salinity and turbidity and tide making their courteous little waves. Kids from the middle school filed in wearing boots 2 sizes too hopeful. A fisherman rolled up his sleeve and showed a scar with a story set where the map now bent. The tribal liaison led a short walk at low water, stopping to point out the old lines in the flats where gardens shaped hunger into knowledge. A reporter took pictures of graphs instead of faces. Harper stood at the lectern we'd borrowed from the Grange and read the beneficiary statement she had written and folded and rewritten. She kept it short. The trust is a promise, she said, and promises are public things. She pledged transparent operations, rapid reporting, and a willingness to be corrected. Her voice didn't wobble. May stood to the side with a ribbon that was really twine and used my shop shears to cut it while the room clapped hard enough to cover the nearby gulls. The smear accounts that had treated me like a hobby went quiet in the week before the event. 2 pulled their posts. 1 posted a correction that described itself as clarifying context. Devin's final message came the day we mounted the sign. 2 sentences wishing us luck and stating that he'd be focusing on other opportunities. I moved the email into a folder I call Silt and closed the lid on the laptop. Some things settle if you stop stirring. At the shop the next week, students stood in a semicircle that used to be mine. I ran a fingertip along the bench scarred by 100 practice mortises and felt the way muscle memory can be a kind of homecoming. I opened with a lesson that wasn't in the syllabus: measure clean, preserve the chain, and know when silence protects the work better than noise. A freshman looked like he might take notes on the last clause. I told him to write it down later after he'd planned a true face. Harper changed a censor solo the first calm evening of March. She clipped her braid through the back of her cap the way Elena used to and leaned over the rail with her weight where it belonged. I stood behind her and didn't fix the things she didn't need fixed. The connector gave. The graph bounced. She glanced back and the grin had the Whitaker crookedness and Elena's patience in it. "You kept the promise," I said. "We're learning to keep it," she answered, and wrote the calibration time in her own log without asking which pen. We drafted redundancy like a ritual. I backed up the week to 2 drives and a cloud bucket with a boring name. I labeled cards with dates that meant something on the bay, not in Rome. I updated the SOP in a tone designed to outlast anybody's temper. I pinned Resolution 2341 to the Boathouse wall and slid a plastic sleeve over it so Salt would have to work for its meal. Across the room, the map with the red curve had become a tired photocopy pinned beside a stamped drawing. The imagined line had hardened into a route that would keep its distance from the flat. People drifted in and out. The science teacher booked another tide morning and promised better boots. The fisherman nodded about nets that came up cleaner on moonless nights. The liaison set a date to bring elders for a walk that would have more listening than talking. The paper ran a photo of 2 spines, Bay Log, GDW and Station Log, HW, leaning on each other under the new sign. The caption read, "When the tide watches back." At dusk, the bay took on the particular blue that suggests rest without making guarantees. The cleats creaked less. The sensors blinked even, obedient little stars. I wrote the day's entry the way you tamp a footing: resolution passed, framework signed, inquiry advanced, suspension lifted, doors opened. Children asked better questions than we did. Beneath it, I drew a short line and added 3 words Elena taught me when she was still teaching me how to see. Foundation before frame. Then I closed the book and set it beside Harper's, the 2 covers touching, and listened until the water's slow breath matched my own. Dawn came soft and square, the kind of light that makes edges honest. The bay breathed without drama, a long inhale that smoothed the skin between ripple and calm. I unlocked the boathouse and let the door swing wide like a chest finding its rhythm. Oil and Salt met me at the threshold, familiar as a handshake. The dashboard on the wall blinked its small green vow: conductivity steady, turbidity clean, tide easing up from low. The room no longer whispered about what might burn. It asked for maintenance, for lists, for patience, dressed as routine. On the bench, I'd set a shadow box I'd built from a strip of quarter-sawn white oak. Inside lay the old brass key that had tugged at my pocket like a second heart the night I broke my promise. I'd rubbed the metal with a soft cloth until it remembered its shine. Under it, on a thin plaque I cut with the small router, I etched 2 words the long year had taught me: vault, vow. Harper held a level against the wall beside Resolution 2341 while I marked the studs. The screws bit clean, the box seated, and the key faced the room without apology. We didn't say anything. Meaning doesn't improve when narrated. At the college, the workshop filled the wood lab with a mixed crowd: students, port clerks, a fisherman who hated chairs, 2 reporters, a science teacher with her clipboard. I didn't thank everyone for coming or apologize for speaking. I wrote 3 words on the board and let the chalk dust drift: measure, preserve, proceed. I passed around a chain of custody diagram that looked more like a furniture plan than a legal instrument. I showed how evidence breathes when you hurry it and how silence can be a kind of brace. A student asked what to do if they smeared me again. "We build the record," I said. Another asked when to speak. "When the work can stand without you," I answered. Back at the bay, Harper had written "station log," HW across the spine of a fresh notebook, and begun dividing a month into small, useful shifts. Her notes looked like Elena's, clean lanes of ink, margins saved for later thought. She taped a paragraph from her beneficiary statement above the dashboard. "Trust is stewardship practiced daily." The line wasn't pretty, it was better than pretty. It was functional. She built patrol calendars with 2 teenagers who wanted to touch the instruments and made them promise not to post anything until the numbers had a chance to become something other than a selfie. That night, when the shop lights in town laid their thin gold on the water, I wrote a letter to Elena I wouldn't mail. I told her the sign with her name looked less new in the fog and more like something that had waited under the surface for us to lift it. I told her the first scholarship application had arrived from a girl who fishes weekends and wants to measure eelgrass with her hands. I admitted the ways I had been dumb, how anger wears the clever mask of action, how noise counterfeits proof. I thanked her for the long ebb, for the sentence that held, "Don't act when the water tells you to wait." I folded the paper and slid it into the drawer with the recorder, a small private tide. When the flats opened under a generous low, the liaison led a tide walk that did more for the town than any meeting with microphones. Elders pointed to lines in the earth older than our arguments, scallop shelves where clam gardens had learned the tide instead of defying it. The fishermen told stories that expanded slowly instead of exploding. Kids dug with their hands and looked up when the graph on the tablet flickered into meaning. "The tide sets the metronome," the liaison said, and I wrote it in the bay log as if law. We stood in our coats and let the cold make room for attention. Local news stitched a sober timeline with the grace that comes from curiosity instead of appetite. The cut clip, the counterproof, the MOU, the dashboard, the vote. A Pacific Crown engineer looked into the camera and said they would stick to map B and publish their numbers without varnish. The company's PR voice stayed on mute. Devin didn't call. Silence can be malice, but sometimes it's just an absence finding the door. 3 years stretched ahead like a blueprint that has to become studs and fasteners. Lydia pressed a calendar into my hand with audits marked in ink that presumed we'd still be here. "A process is a kind fence," she said in the parking lot, shrugging into her coat. I logged the next sensor maintenance and circled spawning month in red. Harper assigned night rounds to the school group and taught them the small kindness of labeling cables before you put them away. Responsibility warms differently than applause. It travels from hand to hand until it becomes custom. At dusk, we worked quiet the way people who trust the floor work quiet. Harper swapped a battery on the outer sensor while I checked the tide against the chart. She didn't ask for help. I kept my hands at my sides and counted my breath. The light on the housing went dark, then blinked back to green. "We keep the promise," she said without looking over. "One tide at a time," I answered. She wrote the time and initials in her log, and the page took the ink like it had been waiting for that line. Inside, the dashboard drew a thin, obedient curve. The gauge lights chimed a friendly, pointless beep. The key in the box caught a sliver of window light and threw it back small and square. The rope on the cleat stopped its old complaint and took the load like it had decided to trust us again. I wrote my last entry of the long chapter. No fireworks, just nouns and times and weather, and under it a sentence that fit better than triumph. Honor isn't returned, it is measured again. Then I closed the book and set it against Harper's so their spines touched, the 2 logs leaning like oars laid ready for the next lift of water, and we stood listening until the room in the bay kept the same slow time, In the end, what survives a storm isn't volume, it's structure. Reputation isn't handed back by applause, it's rebuilt plank by a record that doesn't blink. The lesson is simple and stubborn. When the water runs loud, breathe, measure, preserve, and then proceed. Choose the long water. Let patience carry weight. Facts, process, and community are the quiet tools that outlast slogans. A promise can start as a key in a pocket and end as a vow on a wall. It lives when routines become rituals, logs kept clean, data open to daylight, agreements honored when no one is looking. Progress doesn't roar. It hums through small corrections, transparent dashboards, and hands that learn to work together. The tide's wisdom is not mystical, it's practical. Step when the sand firms, halt when it softens, and keep your bearings by the landmarks that do not advertise themselves. Integrity, stewardship. If there is a moral, it's this: don't trade the truth for speed or dignity for convenience. Build the record. Share the evidence. Welcome scrutiny. And when the noise crescendos, remember that silence can be strength if it protects the work. Foundations before frames, frames before finish. Finish that answers to the elements over time. That is how honor is measured again and kept. Thank you for spending this time here. If something in this journey resonated, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What stayed with you, what challenged you, what you'd carry into your own life. Drop a comment, join the conversation, and let us know where you're watching from. And if you'd like more stories about resilience, responsibility, and the quiet courage of getting it right, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Until the next tide, take good care and keep your tools sharp.